Hello and welcome to Self-Isolation Station. Today I want to ask a simple question. Whose voice are we listening to? Whose voice are we listening to? It's really important in these times of mass communication and when there's lots of opinions and theological thinking and biblical quotes going on, that we're really careful about whose voice we're listening to. And I want to touch on three different things this morning. Firstly, I want to talk about the encouraging local church that hopefully many of us are experiencing. I personally believe and have seen really and received many encouraging prophetic words from people in the local church. And we read, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 14 about how we're to handle this and a decent framework for it. He says this: follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves, but the one who prophesies edifies the church. And I want you to remember that be encouraging people, be strengthening people, be edifying people. Pray for pictures or for scriptures and share it abundantly once you feel like God's placed someone on your heart. But just make sure it's in that framework. The second thing I want to speak into is prophets that were perhaps more contextual. So we read a lot in the Bible, and I want to focus quickly on Moses in the Old Testament, who was demanding on behalf of God to let God's people come out of slavery in Egypt, away from Pharaoh's tyrannous rule. And one of the things that's interesting about Moses is he is A, incredibly brave, but B, the whole thing is a very specific context. So we see that Moses is saying to Pharaoh, look, unless you soften your heart and let these people go, God's people go, then these plagues and afflictions are going to come on you one after another, these 10 different ones. We see here a contextually raised up prophet who is obedient to God's calling. And we see actually the afflictions and suffering come on Pharaoh until God's will comes about, and eventually they move closer and closer towards the promised land. The reason I say that is often we see many people who might claim to be prophets of God or make perhaps sweeping statements for the world or for all the nations or for this is for all Christians. And particularly in times we're experiencing at the moment, we have to be very careful as to whose voice we're listening to. And in my experience, and when I read the scriptures, I think it's good to be listening to people speaking out prophetically, perhaps local to you. And now that doesn't mean we can't get encouragement and we can't listen to people from other nations. But we have to be very careful as to whose voice we're listening to and ensure that they are a trusted source and that it's still coming in the framework of strengthening, edifying, and comforting. Now, this doesn't mean it wouldn't be challenging. There's people that are raised up prophetically that bring very challenging words to our lifestyle. And some prophets are spot on and are accurate and, really say things that are from God. But for every one of those, I'm also experiencing an abundance of people that are saying things that are perhaps unhelpful. So we need to be careful about that. The final thing I just want to touch on with that is firstly, not to judge. Perhaps when something's shared around on social media that you don't agree with, that's been shared, perhaps then that word wasn't for you and perhaps doesn't make sense for your context. And another thing I would say, let's be really careful. Anyone with a big platform or microphone, let's just be really careful about what we're saying at this time. If we make sweeping statements like, for example, I've read, God at the moment is shaking up all the nations and we're going through a hard time of suffering so that our rebelling ends. Well, for me, that's a very westernized perspective because a majority of the world actually are going through and have been for decades and centuries, often very difficult hardships. So to say to them, well, God's putting you through this just so you can learn something and stop rebelling, I think we have to be very, very careful with what we say because that is very much the perspective, the lens that you are speaking with. And that can be the issue that we have with this, with social media and very quick communication. So those three things, just to recap. Let's be locally prophesying and encouraging, giving comforting, edifying and strengthening words of knowledge, pictures and scriptures to each other. Let's also read the word and understand the kind of prophets that God raises up and what was on their heart and what he did, and look at the context for what they happened, like with Moses. And the third thing is, let's just be careful with what we're saying with our platform on social media, and be careful as to who we're listening to. And let's just be following God's life and worshipping him at every single opportunity. Let's look for patterns of worship and patterns of things that we can go after. God is eternal and has an incredible pattern of who he is and how amazing he is. And let's be looking out for the bright and beautiful things of this world and encouraging each other with smiles and with peace and love and joy. Okay? Bye-bye. Can you say bye-bye? Bye. Bye.